Hello, and welcome to this latest episode of Talk About London, a podcast about how to make the capital city a better place. I'm Leanne, Chair of the London Society, one of the oldest charitable civic societies in the UK. It's for anyone who loves London.
And I'm Dave Hill, a journalist who writes about London and is editor and publisher of the website onlondon.co.uk.
Our theme for this show is Oxford Street, which has become the focus of much attention lately because Sir Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, has a plan to transform it, including some pedestrianisation.
And our guest to discuss the many burning issues raised by this is Alexander Jan. Alex used to be chief economist at Arup, where he led work on many transport and other infrastructure projects. And these days he chairs the Central District Alliance and Hatton Garden Business Improvement Districts, and he is Chief Economic Advisor to the London Property Alliance. Alex, welcome.
Dave, lovely to be here. Lovely to see you, Leanne.
Okay, to bring everyone up to speed, the Mayor announced his plans last September, and it was a great surprise to many people in Westminster Council, which is actually the highway authority for Oxford Street, and had its own plans trundling along very nicely in the way they thought it was going. And they were full on in terms of improving Oxford Street.
But the Mayor stepped in and he intends to set up a mayoral development corporation to take control of the street and its immediate surroundings away from Westminster Council. And he has the backing of national government to do this. His public consultation about the scheme recently came to a close.
And pedestrianisation of Oxford Street has been talked about for many, many years, but for various reasons it's never happened. Local residents continue to have concerns about where the diverted traffic will go instead, and they certainly don't want it trundling down their streets in Marylebone and Mayfair.
Also, pedestrianised areas can attract crime, especially theft from the person, which is already a big problem in the West End. And how should a transformed Oxford Street be designed? What should it look and feel like there? Who should it be for? So Alex, let me start, if I may, with a very broad and general question about this ambitious enterprise. So what is wrong with Oxford Street as it is? And what would a successful transformation of Oxford Street actually achieve?
So, Dave, it's a great question to start off with because it immediately opens up the challenge for the way in which Oxford Street and indeed other parts of central London function, because they're trying to do more than one thing at the same time. So in the case of Oxford Street, it is often talked about as being the nation's high street. It's certainly a major location for Londoners, but it also has international appeal. It's instantly recognisable, certainly the title, the name of it. All over the world it is famous. But at the very local level, it is also an important street for people, for the communities who live either side of it, either both in terms of providing one of the reasons that they live there, but importantly also, they're very conscious of the extent to which Oxford Street activity, if it wasn't on Oxford Street, might make their quality of life more challenging. So to answer the question, what's wrong with it? I think in a way those competing demands on the street have produced tension and a degree of disorder, if you will, with a small d, in terms of the conflicts between the different roles the street is trying to perform. And that's before you get to the issues around the fact that Oxford Street historically has been a major thoroughfare for motorised traffic, particularly bus services that serve east and west of the city.
So what's wrong with it, in a sense, depends on who you are, doesn't it? I mean, there was quite an illuminating London Assembly session a couple of weeks ago where I think a fellow from the Soho Society, for example, was talking, and he was making the case, and I'm sure this goes for other residents of the area, that a lot has already changed in recent years. For example, there are many fewer buses going down Oxford Street than there used to be.
Yeah.
And their argument is a lot of the big problems have been have been tackled. Air quality is better than it was, for example, as well. Why not leave it alone? Why create a whole load of other stuff going on which might not work out very well? So that's one way of looking at it. But from other people's point of view, pedestrianisation would be a good idea, wouldn't it? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, very important to remember that historically Oxford Street was a major centre of retail activity. Even just post-COVID, Oxford Street, I think, had sales in the region of £3 billion per annum. And it's also a major centre of employment, certainly Oxford Street and the area around it. So with the advent of online shopping, with the loss of tax-free shopping, with the effect of COVID, with the longer-term emergence of shopping malls, shopping centres, the big Westfield centres in Shepherd's Bush direction, White City, and also over towards Stratford. Oxford Street has come under a lot of pressure in terms of being able to meet people's expectations and standards of the sort of environment that they want to be able to shop in and sit down and eat in and so forth. And of course, because it's an open street, it is, as you've already intimated, it is much harder to control it than an enclosed environment such as the big out-of-town centres, taking those as examples.
Would you say, just to butt in, so would you say that retailers, the big retailers that we all know about, the household names, the great department stores and so on, and the other retailers on the street, do you think, broadly speaking, they are in favour of some pedestrianisation, lots of pedestrianisation? What does it? Are they the people who are in favour of this, or do they themselves have some uncertainties about it? Would you say?
So I think, the point I was going to make was that I think everybody, whether they're residents, Westminster City Council, which is the current planning and highway authority for the area, the mayor, businesses, everybody wants to see it improved. So that's the first thing to say. I think many of the businesses in and around Oxford Street would like to see the traffic tamed further, and indeed some of them are particularly in favour of pedestrianisation. The real challenge comes as to the how. So what interventions can you make that will, yes, enhance Oxford Street, but won't in the process damage the surrounding areas? And that's where we get into some of the nitty-gritty of the challenges that need to be unpicked and addressed.
Alex, that's really interesting. I'm intrigued as to why the mayor decided to intervene now, because he's got a lot on his plate. The inbox is pretty full, and Westminster Council appeared to have it under control. So why did he step in?
So, the motivation for the mayor stepping in was because he, and there were a number of motivations that he has given publicly for wanting to get involved. But one of them, which is not limited to him, by the way, previous mayors have also wanted to do something about Oxford Street, is really to try and restore Oxford Street as a major retail, high-quality destination, and make it more attractive and accessible to lots of people, primarily Londoners, I guess, given they're his constituents, but also for the country as a whole, and indeed for international visitors and tourists. And one of the things that we haven't yet talked about is the fact that, of course, Oxford Street benefits from having two of the new Elizabeth Line stations on it, which probably between them cost £1 billion to £2 billion, and are handling in the region of 50 to 60 million passengers a year each. So now the Elizabeth Line is built, now those stations have been created, I think it's perfectly reasonable that the mayor and other city leaders of London, would be saying, well, what is the experience that people have when they come out of these cathedral-like stations? What are they confronted with? What is the offer for them? And are we really making the best use, seizing the opportunity to maximise the contribution of Oxford Street to to the economy, to growth, to employment, to sustainability for the centre of the city as a whole.
And I think that, as you say, for me, and I'm sure some of our listeners, Oxford Street represents one of those really, really knotty problems, because most people, especially if they're international tourists or people who are there to shop, don't realise that there are people who live there. And yet the people who live there obviously vote for the local councillors. So you've got these almost unmatchable needs with the two groups of people. Do you think that's why also the mayor has said, I've got to take it out of Westminster's control, just so that we can solve the problem on behalf of the entire city as well as the UK?
So, I mean, interestingly, very few people actually live on Oxford Street proper itself. But you're absolutely right. There are residential communities, particularly in Soho, in Fitzrovia, where I am at the moment, in Marylebone, and Knightsbridge to a certain extent on the at the the western end, the southwestern sort of geography around Oxford Street. So, but the big concern is, of course, for them is how any attempt to pedestrianise the street will affect their neighbourhoods. Mm-hmm. Historically, Oxford Street was kind of designed in such a way, and the main streets around Regent Street as well, to limit the interaction between the residential areas and the main commercial thoroughfare. And you can see that by walking down Regent Street, for example, and how the streets which go into Soho are narrower than the streets which form part of the retail offer. So historically, these areas have kind of they've rubbed along, they've got along. The real concern for residents, whether or not it's borne out or not, is the extent to which changes to Oxford Street will lead to adverse changes for them in terms of traffic, but also antisocial behaviour, volumes of people, noise, litter, theft, and general disruption to their daily lives.
Yes, and I think it's worth mentioning at this point that not everybody who lives in those bits of the West End is filthy rich. There are actually quite a lot of social housing in that part of Westminster, which is often forgotten about. So you sometimes encounter a rather unkind attitude, I think, to people who are concerned about pedestrianisation, which goes, well, why did you move there? It's the centre of a big city. What did you expect? But a significant number of people have lived there in communities that aren't wealthy for a very long time, and they don't really have the option of just pushing off because they don't like it anyway. So I think that's another dimension of the kind of conflicts and tensions that surround this whole issue, I think.
It is, Dave, and I think it would be wrong to dismiss many of the concerns of the people who live in these neighbourhoods as being NIMBY or whatever. I mean, these central London in particular, and we know this just by looking at the statistics in terms of the number of people who use the tube, who I've mentioned, 50 million at Oxford Circus, nearly 60 million at Tottenham Court Road, 37 million at Bond Street and counting. Between 100 to 150, 200 million visitors a year. So the pressure on these areas in terms of usage is very great. The levels of crime associated with that volume of use is very significant. And the way in which we do things in Britain means that these local authorities in the centre of London, which collect a lot of taxes from businesses, actually only retain a very small proportion of the money they're collecting. So, you could argue that if we lived in a world where more of the taxes collected locally were spent on higher quality provision of public services, that would be a natural feedback mechanism to address many people's concerns around the quality of life impact associated with these big numbers of visitors.
Okay. Leanne, did you want to come in? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so would, there's talk of the Mayoral Development Corporation, and would that include the sort of policing of the area as well? So could they take more money, hive off more money to make it safer? Because obviously it's a key tourist gateway for London as well. So I'm just wondering how that would work. Would you have a Mayoral Development Corporation running Oxford Street, but the local authorities still having to pay for policing or the rubbish, all of those sorts of things? I mean, how would that work? I don't quite get that.
Sure, and it's a great question which requires a very long answer, which we haven't got time for. But in essence, policing kind of already comes under the control of the mayor. It also involves the Home Secretary and, for completeness, the Crown. So there are three parties involved in the way the Metropolitan Police operates. But policing is not normally affected by development corporations. Development corporations are typically used in areas which need to be developed, such as around the Olympic Park, as Dave knows from his excellent book, or areas around Nine Elms is another example, or the Royal Docks, where these zones are set up with the intention of trying to accelerate and often encourage lots of development quickly in order to create new parts of the city. And these operate not only in London but in other areas of the country as well. Now, obviously, Oxford Street doesn't fall into that category because it's already built up and lived in, and indeed has major infrastructure serving it. So how the Mayoral Development Corporation on Oxford Street is going to actually function and operate is something that I think we'll find out more about in the coming weeks and months. But at the moment, it's not entirely clear either the extent to which it will take planning powers associated with large-scale development over the area, or indeed where the money's going to come from to improve or invest in public services, for example, in order to create and maintain a more high-quality pedestrianised environment.
So this is similar to a point that was made very eloquently to me by Jeff Barraclough, who's one of the key cabinet member in Westminster, who spent 2 years trying to build the kind of consensus and reconcile those competing needs that you spoke about, Leanne, and they just about ordered all the paving stones that they needed for their nice new bits of public realm, and that's when Sadiq and Angela Rayner turned up. But he made the point to me before that happened. I was asking him about pedestrianisation, that it's a very long bit of street to actually maintain in every respect. It's about policing, it's about keeping it clean, it's about all of those things. And I think he felt that it was probably impractical. And it's interesting, it's worth noting, I think, that the first, we might start off with, and maybe, who knows, only finish with just quite a small part of the street being actually pedestrianised between Oxford Circus and Selfridges. It certainly looks as if it would be done in bits. So, it's an unfolding story, and we don't really quite know where it's going to end. But Alex, do you think it's a good idea in principle for things that are of London-wide, not only London-wide, but national importance, like Oxford Street and that bit of the West End, to have a bit more top-down control and not be left to local authorities so much?
Well, I think, let's put it this way, Dave. I think the way in which central London is governed is very unusual for a major city. So if we were in New York, for example, there are 5 boroughs which cover a city with the population of the whole of Greater London, right? Nearly 9 million people. Now, London has 32 boroughs plus the City of London, the square mile. Now, in central London, we have a remarkable situation where there are about 10 local authorities, all with a sort of pizza slice part of central London in terms of governance, provision of services, day-to-day management of the area. And I think that creates boundaries and interfaces which makes it harder to look after central London if you're thinking about its citywide, national and international roles.
So maybe yes, but I suppose it all depends on how it's done really in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the case for having better governance of central London, more coordinated, more holistic, is strong. I think that is strong. I think one's always got to be careful about advocating for reorganizing things, just because that can prove to be a distraction with getting on with dealing with the problems. But if we could, if in some shape or form, the Oxford Street development area and development corporation could be used as a mechanism not only to pay for all the new paving and the planters and the granite and everything else, but also working with the new West End company bids and the other business organisations to look after the area and provide better public services. I think that would go a long way to dealing with residents' concerns in particular, and actually would be of tremendous benefit for everybody using the street, because the risk is that we get a great street in terms of the capital investment that goes in, and then there isn't money for looking after it. That's the big risk with these projects. And then the residents will go nuts.
Yes, yes. And I think I haven't done a toilet count on Oxford Street, but I suspect it has, we've been relying for a long time on the major department stores that have existed, and now as they are reduced in number, and I'm just wondering, if I was a resident, there's probably, that sort of antisocial behaviour, and that's a massive issue around Soho and the side streets and everywhere else. So I think with the redevelopment of Oxford Street, the mayor has to look at all of the services and not just, as you say, the sort of starting point and it looking nice. It's got to be ongoing maintenance.
I think that's right. And, one can have tremendous sympathy for the boroughs, because 80% of their funding goes on the provision of statutory services, so services they have to provide by law, which actually most people don't see. So these are very important services around adult social care, around special needs provision, and a whole range of social service activities. And leaves around 20%, in rough terms, for them to spend on things that people do see. And of course, when you add that into the equation I mentioned before, which is that Westminster, City of London, Camden will keep less than 10% of the business rates they're collecting, you can see why the boroughs, understandably from a resourcing point of view, struggle to provide the level of frontline services on these streets, which can then compete with the Westfields of this world. Now, the business improvement district movement is partly about addressing that gap. So that's where businesses come together. They vote for an additional small supplement on their business rates, and all of that money is spent locally. But in a street with, between 100 and 200 million visitors a year, there's only so far a bid type initiative can go when you're talking about expensive services like policing, or, deep cleans and all the rest of it. Those, policing is a very, very expensive business, and a few £1 million from the local bids will only take you so far in terms of tackling that challenge.
Okay. Would it be fun for us, all three of us, to try and imagine what it might look like when it's finished, or when it's partially finished, do you think? I mean, Sadiq Khan right at the beginning talked about creating a tree-lined boulevard, and another interested party, whose identity I will not reveal, thought that it would be great if there was an area where there were traditional London phone boxes, because tourists and other visitors, they love to stand next to those and be photographed, and having some stuff like that would bring in lots and lots of custom. I don't know if that's a good idea or not. What are your thoughts on that kind of thing, Alex and Leanne?
Well,
Well,
Alex,
you go
can
first.
first.
No, you go first, because then he set a trap for me on phone boxes, so you should go first.
So I'm a big fan of trees. I mean, I think that's a definite win. And it's interesting because in Sydney, and I know Finn Harper wrote about this in The Guardian, compared the pedestrianisation of Oxford Street with George Street in Sydney. And that's not entirely true, because what they've done, they've taken out the cars in George Street, but they've still got the tram running right down the centre. So it's not really a boulevard that you can sit and meander. I mean, you've still got to run across the road and not get hit by a tram coming the other way. So I think that I would be inclined to definitely go for trees and, sort of portioning off bits. Someone has to be very clever in the way that they create zones that people want to hang in, because I think you're right, Dave and Alex, very, very long street. And you can imagine, just as it is now from a retail point of view, there are dead zones. And I'm not going to say, I don't want to insult anyone, but there are some areas you go to that are really busy and lovely, and there are some that have been more troublesome. And I guess that's the problem with looking after a long zone. But definitely, we're all going... greening is a very important part, and we need it. It cools the place down for the environment and everything else.
If I had £1 for every time a graphic rendering of Oxford Street in the Brave New World has been produced, and I saw Councillor Paul de Moldenberg has written an excellent account of how long the Oxford Street story has been going, in terms of people trying to deal with it for at least 50, 60 years to try and improve it. I mean, there are lots of renderings showing how it might look. I can't help coming back to the cold reality of the importance of how it's then looked after, whatever you do with it. Mm-hmm. And we know the curse of roadworks, for example, where our friends at the utilities often, not always, but often have a habit of digging things up and not putting things back the way they were before, is a classic example of a problem that will need vigorous management in order to prevent the street from being spoilt very quickly. And on phone boxes, yes, lovely to have the traditional red phone boxes. You're absolutely right, Dave. They're a great tourist attraction. We probably need to get rid of all the horrible ones whilst we're at it, because even more phone boxes, which may be attractive, will lipstick on a pig if all of the other nasties which are in certain parts of central London are allowed to persist.
Okay. Well, I'd like to ask one more question. I put you on the spot here, Alex. You mentioned that very good piece that Paul de Moldenberg wrote for onlondon.co.uk about the history of attempts to improve Oxford Street, and he sort of asked, as he would as a member of the current Westminster Council administration, I wonder, he asked, not his exact words, will it actually happen this time? What's being planned this time? So what do you think the chances are of Sadiq's vision being realised?
Well, I think that there's a strong chance that something will happen. I think the political determination behind improving Oxford Street is serious at the mayoral level. And as you pointed out in your opening remarks, Dave, this has also got national government sponsorship. So the government is also interested in it. I mean, in a way... So, and I think that's fundamental to anything happening. I think that whatever is proposed in terms of dealing with this traffic challenge in particular will have to be very well thought out in order for it to have public acceptability and indeed acceptability in the surrounding areas. So it's going to take some smart thinking, and the slight risk with full pedestrianisation, whatever that means, is the risk with that is that it fetters your ability to adapt the street's function to respond to the demands that are being put upon it at any time of the day, week, or month of the year. So in some ways, a more pragmatic approach which said Oxford Street is pedestrianised between the following hours when people want to be on it and use it, but is open for deliveries or night bus movements or whatever it might be at other times, might be a way of squaring the circle. I'm just not entirely sure that necessarily fits with the Mayor's vision for the street.
Okay, thank you.
From a pedestrianisation point of view.
And I think there's a definite issue about particularly older people or disabled people being able to navigate up and down the street. And I don't know, I mean, trams are hugely expensive, and lots of people have talked about trams, but there could be something in terms of electric buses or some sort of, movement from Marble Arch up to Tottenham Court Road that goes up and down, something sort of more discreet, because I'm not sure what the figures are for people needing mobility just between those 2 points. I know a lot of people catch a bus, but they're going on a longer journey from one point to the next. So, and I'm not a bus timetable expert, but I can see that would be an issue. If you want to go from one end to the other, it's a long way to walk if you're not in fine fettle.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, and I think only very few of us probably have walked the full length of Oxford Street. There might be others, because of course what we haven't talked about is what's at the other ends, right? Marble Arch and the potential to do something at the Marble Arch end, which I know there are, various ideas to do something around that end, and indeed at the other end at Tottenham Court Road, a borough boundary, where there's also an opportunity with the new station and outernet and various other things to make that area a little bit more attractive. I mean, it is worth saying that the rail, the underground and the Elizabeth line stations, which do serve Oxford Street, are now probably as good as they're going to be in terms of providing that form of moving around. And, Bond Street and Tottenham Court Road both have what they call step-free access. That isn't the case at Marble Arch or at Oxford Circus. So I do wonder whether or not any attempts to reduce the availability of bus services on Oxford Street or very close to it may require thinking about how taxis can be brought closer to the pedestrianised bit, or indeed putting in lifts at Oxford Circus and Marble Arch as part of any way to help those who are unable to walk distances to move up and down the street. But those again are expensive schemes. They're very expensive schemes to product. Lifts are expensive, as London Underground will tell us.
Okay, well, we've been going for more than half an hour now. Have you got any other really burning questions to ask, Leanne?
I've got lots of burning questions. I think what would be great is actually doing a follow-up on this with perhaps some taxi drivers or people talking about transport, because I know they always felt or feel left out of a lot of these conversations. But I think it's a fascinating watching brief, and I think what we haven't discussed either is just how crowded Oxford Street is now post-pandemic on the pedestrian side. Maybe I'm just a faster walker than everyone else, but if you're a tourist, you're there to look and dwell and mosey, and of course people like me are always in a rush trying to get around the tourists, and we need a bit more pavement space in any case. So I think it's going to be an interesting journey.
Okay, well, shall we leave it there? And lots of themes to return to. We might even invite Alex to come back one day, since he's been so good. But at this point, Alex, you have to say goodbye so that Leanne and I can talk about you behind your back for 2 minutes. But we promise to only say nice things. So we'd like to say goodbye now, and we'll catch up later. Goodbye.
Goodbye now, and lovely to talk to you both.
Hey, right. Well, that was good. We covered lots of ground. What were your conclusions, Leanne?
Well, I definitely get the sense that there is something is going to happen this time. So that's a very good thing. And Alex spoke about Paul de Moldenberg's piece, which is on London, which is a fantastic history of all the times Oxford Street has tried to be dealt with. And I think people will be pleased to know that everyone's been complaining about Oxford Street for about 70 years. So that's reassuring. But it's just a unique place because it does talk to so many different communities, and everyone feels a sense of ownership. So it's very, very difficult to keep everyone happy. But we must be able to find a solution.
You would think so. I mean, I think Alex, one of the great things about talking to Alex about this is that he does see the big picture. You know, he can see the need and the difficulties involved with reconciling those conflicting requirements of the street for different people with a legitimate interest in it, and he sees that very clearly. And I would, my hope, I suppose, is that the mayor and the development corporation, assuming it goes ahead, the government has to give permission for more, it looks like it will, are as sort of sensitive to the nuances and balances of that whole section of the West End as Alex is. And that way we might get a result that everybody is, you know, either very happy with or happy enough with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Alex, for me, really also highlighted that the sort of weird situation with central London, where you have so many boroughs having a little bit of the pie, and you think about somewhere like Camden, which is just a slither into central London, and then, you know, they've still got to worry about all of their other constituents all over the north of the borough. So, you know, one would think that we will end up having to have a sort of central London oversight committee or something like that. And I don't want to make it more complicated, but it seems like an odd way to manage a city like London.
Yes, well, a good point on which to end, and it just captures so many of the difficulties. A lot of people think it's just a piece of cake to pedestrianise Oxford Street. It really, really isn't, and I hope that our audience has, you know, got a fuller sense of all the different factors involved, having had that great interview with Alex.
Yes,
so shall we say goodbye?
Goodbye.
Goodbye, audience, and thank you for being with us. It's been lovely. Bye.
Bye.